Hello, world, and welcome to the In My Footsteps podcast. I am Christopher Setterlin, coming to you from the vacation destination known as Cape Cod, Massachusetts, and this is episode 227. The dark days of winter continue, but come on in, warm your feet by the fire. I've got loads of GenX nostalgia and pop culture for you. We're going to kick it off with a look back to the turn of the century, the 21st century, and some of the biggest product fails of the 2000s. How many of these did you waste your money on? In celebrating the finale of Stranger Things, we are going to do a deep dive into the history and lore of the Dungeons & Dragons role-playing game. There's going to be a brand new top 5 as we look at the top 5 most influential songs ever recorded. And there'll be a brand new This Week in History and Time Capsule, looking back at the debut, the creation of the telegraph communication system. All of that is coming up right now on episode 227 of the In My Footsteps podcast. So what are we going to talk about this week? How it's the bleak days of winter, New Year's is over, we've got nothing to look forward to until spring begins. Real cheerful way to start the show off. Wherever you are, if it's super snowy, if it's warm, thank you for tuning in to my show. Thank you for getting your weekly dose of GenX nostalgia. It's always fun to do these shows, but during these times where Stranger Things is ending, it seems like a brighter light has been shined on us Gen Xers. Our lives, our childhoods, what we got to enjoy. Don't worry, if you haven't seen the finale of Stranger Things, I'm not going to do any sort of spoilers. I will say it got me all up in my feels, all up in the emotions, so much so that I changed my plans, my intentions for 2026, and actually wrote a blog post kind of connecting the Stranger Things show to me, my childhood, and Generation X, our lives in general. I'll link to that blog post in the notes for the show if you want to read it. So I won't be giving any spoilers, but there will be a lot of Stranger Things references in this episode because we're going to be doing a big segment at the end on Dungeons & Dragons. But before we get into the meat of this podcast sandwich, I can't start the show off without thanking my Patreon subscribers. Lori, Mary Lou, Ashley, Kevin, Leo, Marguerite, Neglectoid, Crystal, Matt, Dr. Shrimp, Porto Chico. Thank you all for being my biggest supporters, my biggest backers. Those of you that put your money where your mouth is to support me, my never-ending dream of being a full-time, self-employed content creator. If you want a shout-out on the podcast, you can go become a member on Patreon for $5 a month. You get access to bonus podcast episodes. There's one at the top of every month that looks at my old initial impressions blogs that I wrote in the early 2010s. And now we've also got the hidden track bonus podcasts. These are a little bit more of a deep dive into something I might have spoken about on the podcast, a proper podcast, in the past. They're about 15 minutes long. So for example, the very first Hidden Tracks podcast went up last week. And it features the Isolator helmet and the original TV hat products. That one is up on Patreon for all members, free and paying, so I'll link to that in the podcast notes as well. I've also got the link in the podcast notes for you if you want to buy a Blu-ray copy of my acting debut film, Cape Cod Cthulhu. The irony is I bought my copy, but I don't have a DVD player. It's all right. It's the thought that counts. I want to add it to my collection, even if I can't play it. Hell, my laptop that I'm recording this podcast on doesn't even have a CD drive on it. It's like advanced, but yet not advanced. It doesn't even have a spot for me to put a memory card in for my camera. I had to get an adapter for that. Well, it was simpler in the 90s, wasn't it? So hopefully wherever you are, you're staying warm. Let's crack one open and get into the podcast proper by talking about 2000s product fails. I'm proud to say I didn't own any of these, but I'm sorry if you did, so let's get into them. The decade of the 2000s doesn't seem like it could be that long ago. And then you look up and it's 2026, which means that 2000 was 26 years ago. For people of my age, it's like what the late 60s were to our time in high school. Every time I think about that, more of my hair turns gray. But with the rise of social media, the internet, iPad, iPhone, smartphones in general, GPS navigation, all this in the 2000s was coming up. There were also a lot of product failures, just bombs that came and went in a flash, or came with a lot of hype and then just flamed out. So what I've got here is 10 examples from the 2000s. The only catch with these is they had to have been released from January 1st, 2000 to December 31st, 2009. And that date, that distinction is important because one of these came in right under the wire, but it is such a bomb, I said I need to put that in. For me, and this is just my opinions, when I was thinking of product fails of the 2000s, the very first one I thought of was the Microsoft Zune. Do you remember the Zune? The Zune was a line of MP3 players meant to rival the iPod. They were released in 2006 to a lot of fanfare. You had all the same tropes of an iPod where it could play music, videos, it had its own software. Instead of the iTunes store, they had the Zune Marketplace. There was the Zune Music Pass, which was their subscription service like Apple Music. The Zune actually had a bigger screen than the original iPods did. And they had the capability for wireless sharing with nearby devices, so you could send music to your friends if they had a Zune, which they probably didn't. I tell you all of these specs about the Zune, and I'm sure, like I thought in the day, you're probably thinking the same thing. Like, yeah, the iPod does all that same stuff. That's basically its downfall. The Zune never got the market share that it wanted because the iPod was already out. The first iPod came out in November 2001, so you're looking at almost a 5-year head start of customer satisfaction that led to the Zune's ultimate downfall in 2012. Software updates were discontinued in 2011, and the models it was just shut down in 2012. It didn't help that soon came the iPhone, where basically you didn't need an iPod anymore, your phone just had all your music on it. Fun fact though, the Zune is still around a little bit. There's a modification community that keep updating their Zunes. So if you've got one collecting dust in the attic, maybe you can bring it back to life. Next up, we have a vehicle that didn't kill a company, but it sure as hell put a bullet into them. And that's the Pontiac Aztek crossover SUV. This was a mid-size SUV, kind of what you would expect. It was originally shared as a concept vehicle in 1999, going on sale in the summer of 2000, and then being launched nationally in 2001. It was launched with the tagline, quite possibly the most versatile vehicle on the planet. Fun fact, this vehicle was marketed towards the GenX driver. Yes, those of you around my age, you Gen Xers, this Pontiac Aztek was marketed towards us. It succeeded just as well as OK Soda did for the Gen Xers. First and foremost, this is considered one of the ugliest cars ever created. It was meant to be innovative, but it was basically the old Chevy Venture minivan repackaged as a Pontiac Aztek. GM thought that they would need to sell 75,000 Azteks per year to break even. Their best year in 2002 saw them sell just under 28,000. The Aztek was discontinued as a brand in 2005, and Pontiac was gone by 2009 when General Motors filed for bankruptcy. This third one here had so much hype, and I think they're still around, but nowhere near the level that they were back then, and that's the Segway scooters. So yes, they are around. Google exists for me as well, so I just looked it up. You can go to the Segway store and buy yourself one. These are the ugly scooters, the two big wheels, you stand on the platform, and it's got the handles like a regular scooter would have had. Invented by Dean Kamen, the Segway was brought to market in 2001. It was mostly marketed as something different to get you around in the cities rather than cars or taxis. You could take this hideous-looking scooter around. Kamen got the idea from the iBot, a self-balancing wheelchair. And when it was unveiled on Good Morning America in December 2001, it got a lot of buzz. It's like anything new in transportation will get you buzz. I mean, we got the hoverboards that look nothing like what Back to the Future 2 said, and people went out to get those even though they killed you when you got on them. Even if you thought the Segway was cool, and a lot of people did not, they would cost you upwards of $5,000. Think about the different modes of transportation you could get for less than that. Really high quality bikes. I know you'd have to actually use your legs, but you would save thousands. Despite them being seen as uncool, there were high expectations for the first full year of sales, with the target being 40,000 units sold. They did not reach that goal. In fact, in the first 5 years combined, they sold just over 23,000 Segways. Their coolness wasn't helped in 2009 with Paul Blart Mall Cop, or when company owner Jim Hesselden died when his Segway went off a cliff. But like I said, you can still get them. You just have a laugh track with it so you can get used to it. This next one could have a laugh track for being useless. That's the Q Cat.
So you're sitting at your computer with your new Q Cat from Radio Shack. Now you can access web pages even easier and faster than before. Just swipe the cat across a special Q code and watch the exact web page you want download right before your eyes.
The Q Cat was a cat-shaped handheld barcode reader. It was released in 2000 by the Digital Convergence Corporation, most of them for free. It got the Q Cat name as a wordplay on keystroke automation technology. And yes, I know, keystroke is with a K. This came with a USB cord, so it needed to be plugged into a computer for you to read barcodes, so you needed to be near your computer. It would have been better if it was battery operated. If you go on YouTube and look up QCat, you will see videos calling it virtually useless, possibly the worst technology product ever. By the end of 2001, it didn't even read barcodes anymore. And scanning with the device with its original software produced no results. I guess they were lucky that they gave it away free. Do any of you have cat-shaped barcode reader? Do you still have one? Is it a paperweight? Maybe you could have been sitting at your computer with your QCat, drinking a nice can of Coca-Cola Black. Any of you remember that? The gist of it was that it was soda with coffee in it. It sounds like something we would have made in college. It was released in 2006, stylized as BLAK. It came in a brownish can or bottle, kind of a coffee colored, and it had that weird little infinity circle on it for kind of a logo, I guess. Obviously, this is not the worst idea Coca-Cola has ever come up with. That would probably be New Coke still. It wasn't even the first attempt at, I guess, a morning soda, because remember, they had Pepsi AM that was launched in 1989 with 25% more caffeine. But honestly, who wants to have soda with coffee in it, or soda that's coffee flavored? It was a fail, it was a bomb, it was discontinued in 2008. So hey, it lasted longer than New Coke. I never tried it. I remember seeing it and thinking what I'm saying now. Like, why would I want that? Did any of you out there try it? I'm assuming if you did, you would probably be much younger than me. Maybe you're in your late 20s, early 30s now. My daring self wouldn't try it now in my 40s. Next up, we have something that could have worked and was actually a pretty innovative idea, and that is the Motorola Roker cell phones. These were first released in 2005. They were the first phones integrated with iTunes. So it's almost like a precursor to the iPhone. The Roker E1 is known as the iTunes phone. And so right there, if I told you about that in 2005, you'd probably say, wow, that's a great idea. The problem was it had poor performance. You could only get 100 songs on your phone. Just imagine that. how many songs can you fit on your smartphone now? I mean, I probably could fit easily 4,000 to 5,000. That's before deleting any apps I have. Through 2008, there were several more variations of the Roker. None of them sold well, none of them matched the hype of the original. And interestingly, the cap on the number of songs, the clunky software that integrated with iTunes, kind of showed Apple that they needed to be in control of all of it, which basically led to them creating the iPhone. And obviously, that killed the Motorola Roker. The last original Rokers were discontinued in 2009. A failure that I'm pretty sure all of you saw and remember is the colored ketchups by Heinz.
New Heinz Easy Squirt ketchup has a nozzle that makes it easy to draw. On food! Heinz Easy Squirt. It's fun for your food.
These first came out in 2000. They were in the same colored bottles, so you'd have purple or blue. They were marketed as easy squirts. Obviously something that kids would want, because I don't know what adult would want blue ketchup on their fries. In the beginning, the novelty of these, they sold well. Flavors like Blastin' Green, Funky Purple, Stellar Blue, Passion Pink, Awesome Orange, and Totally Teal. The problem is, there needed to be lots of food coloring and then lots of additives to kind of make it taste like ketchup. And I would assume once you've had green, blue, orange ketchup, the novelty kind of wears off. Slowly, sales went down and Heinz colored ketchups were discontinued in 2006. The next one here is something that I had never heard of until I did research for this segment, and that is the UMD movie. UMD, it's Universal Media Discs. These were released for the PlayStation. Full-length films, TV shows, music videos for the PlayStation, more specifically the PSP. A big issue with these was that they were exclusive for the PSP, so you couldn't play them anywhere else. You couldn't create your own videos to play on the PSP. They first came out in the mid-2000s, and another issue was they often cost as much as DVDs did, but with far less content. Within a year of them being released with such low demand for them, Sony cut back on the movies released on the UMD format. Even in the beginning, this was seen as a very niche product. You needed to have a PSP to even watch these. So if you didn't have one, you'd have to go buy one. And it's like if you got DVDs, you could play them on any DVD player, laptop, or any of these video game consoles. Not the UMD. Plus, the rise of digital content kind of spelled the end of the UMD movies within a couple of years of them being released. As we're nearing the end of the 2000s product fails, we come back around to another vehicle that bombed. That's the Ford Excursion. This looked a lot like the Suburbans created by Chevrolet, the gigantic SUVs, like a school bus size. They were around from 2000 to 2005, with even present day rumors that they might be coming back. Their most successful year was their first year in 2000, where they sold 69,000 of these SUVs. In 2001, that number was cut by half. It became the lowest selling SUV marketed by Ford. In 2007, Time magazine picked the Ford Excursion as one of the 50 worst vehicles of all time. I'm sure with the rumors about it maybe coming back, it's people looking back 25 years thinking of the things they could do to improve what it was back then. But those of you that have seen the Excursion or the Chevy Suburban and how gigantic they are, it's like, do you really want one of those? The only way I'd want one is if I haul it out the back and use it for like van life travel. I mean, I guess it's not that bad, except gas would cost so much. I could only travel down the street and just like camp on the side of the road. The final product fail of the 2000s, this is the one that got in just under the wire of the decade, but I needed to put it in. Do you remember the Twitter Peak? This was literally a Twitter-only mobile device released in November 2009. I remember as soon as it came out thinking it was one of the stupidest ideas ever. Having to get a specific mobile device for one website. These stupid things were marketed for $100 with 6 months of service coming with it. Then you'd have to pay $8 a month to use this thing to go on Twitter, or $200 up front for lifetime service. This was back when Twitter was good and not a cesspool garbage dump like it is now, and I wouldn't have paid $100 plus $8 a month just to go on it. In 2010, they created a new peak mobile device that had Facebook and Twitter, and some other social and news features. They all bombed, because why get one of those when you could just get a smartphone? So there you go, looking way, way back to the beginning of the century. Some of the biggest product fails. Did you have any of those? I am sorry if you wasted your money on a Zune, or a Pontiac Aztec, or UMD movies that are just coasters now. You never know, though. Someday that Q-Cat might be worth a ton on eBay. This week in history, we are going back 188 years to January 11th, 1838, and the creation of the telegraph system of communication. With wireless communication in the 2020s, everyone in the world is basically right there connected with you. It is so hard to overstate the importance of telegraph and the telegraph communication to communication today. What we're talking about here is the birth of the electrical telegraph, with the idea for electricity being used for communication emerging in the late 18th century as scientists began to understand electrical phenomenon. There were key contributors like Luigi Galvani, Alessandro Volta, and Hans Christian Ørsted, and it was in the early 1800s where several inventors proposed electrical telegraph systems. Francis Ronalds in 1816 built an early working electric telegraph, but it was dismissed by the British Admiralty as unnecessary. Russian Pavel Schilling demonstrated an electromagnetic telegraph using needles in 1832. Carl Friedrich Gauss and Wilhelm Weber, Germans in 1833, created a telegraph to communicate between buildings at the University of Göttingen. But the big breakthrough in the telegraph came with American Samuel Morse, who was an artist and an inventor. Inspired during a transatlantic voyage in the 1830s, Morse became fascinated with the idea of instant, long-distance communication. It was Morse, along with collaborators Alfred Vail and Leonard Gale, who developed a telegraph system and a symbolic language to accompany it, known as Morse code. Instead of transmitting entire letters electrically, the system sent short and long electrical pulses, dots and dashes that represented letters and numbers. These were the demonstrations in 1838 that started the wheel turning to get Morse code and the telegraph to be adapted nationwide. In 1843, Morse secured funding from U.S. Congress to build an experimental telegraph line between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, Maryland. It was May 24, 1844, that Morse sent the first official telegraph message, "What hath God wrought?" The success of this demonstration marked the beginning of the telegraph age in the United States. By the 1850s, telegraph networks crisscrossed the US and Europe. Private companies emerged, most notably Western Union, which eventually dominated American telegraphy. Telegraph offices became essential features of cities, towns, railroads, and ports. The telegraph transformed the railroad industry, which used it for scheduling and safety. It transformed newspapers because you could gain near instant access to distant news. Financial markets relied on real-time price information. Governments and militaries used it for command and control. The telegraph went across the ocean in 1866 when a durable cable was successfully laid between Ireland and Newfoundland. This reduced message delivery time between continents from weeks to minutes and permanently altered global diplomacy, commerce, and journalism. Telegraphy was the backbone of global communication all the way into the early 20th century. It was Guglielmo Marconi who pioneered wireless telegraphy, transmitting Morse code via radio waves. And this wireless telegraphy became crucial for maritime communication and emergency signaling, most famously during the Titanic disaster of 1912. So the telegraph was huge. It was eventually replaced by the telephone. Then you had radio and television and internet for news. But it all goes back to the telegraph. Every instant message, email, digital notification today traces its lineage back to those early electrical pulses clicking across copper wires. And Samuel Morse first demonstrated his telegraph system 188 years ago this week in history. Sending out my SOS signal for a brand new time capsule. We're going to go back 52 years to January 13th, 1974. What was going on in the world of pop culture back then? Well, let's find out. The number one song was The Joker by Steve Miller Band. Some people call me the Space Cowboy. Some call me the Gangster of Love. This was off of the band's album The Joker and has to be their most successful song. It spent 1 week at number one and was one of 3 number one songs that the Steve Miller Band had. The other ones were Rockin' Me and Abracadabra. The number one movie was The Exorcist, and you could get into the theater with a ticket costing $1.77. This is seen as one of the greatest horror movies ever made, about 12-year-old Reagan McNeil who is possessed by a demon. It was a massive hit with people standing outside in cold, long lines to get in to see it. It was Academy Award nominated for Best Picture. During its original theatrical run, it made $193 million on a budget of $12 million. That's equal to about $1.4 billion when adjusted for inflation to 2026. And it spawned 2 sequels, one that wasn't that good, and then Exorcist 3 that is seen as much, much better. The number one TV show was The Waltons. This is a historical drama series. It was on for 9 seasons about the Walton family in the Depression-era Blue Ridge Mountains in Virginia. It's famous for the ending of the show being the family all saying goodnight to each other. Good night, John boy. There were 221 episodes between 1972 and 1980, and 6 TV movies that followed. And if you were around back then, January 13th, 1974, if you lived in New England, just know that January is remodeling month at Grossman's. There's so many things you can DIY at home, but the best part is you can get some of that famous wood paneling that 70s and 80s homes were known for. It was all over my Nana's walls in such wonderful flavors as gunstock walnut, $2.99 for a 4x8 foot panel, alpine elm, $3.49 for the same size panel, and the expensive weathered pine, $4.99 for the same panel. If you want to make your den look like my Nana's house in the 80s. Oh, but wait, it gets better. Would you like to be in a Grossman's television commercial? Well, there's a form here that you can fill out. They want to know if you have any singing, dancing, acting experience. They also want to know what Grossman's products you have used for your DIY home stuff. Just make it up. They won't check. This could be your big break, so get in on it if you want to be in a Grossman's commercial. 6 locations in Massachusetts, so get on it. Get that wood paneling. But that wraps up another time capsule, another This Week in History. We go from the highly influential wood paneling of the 70s to the most influential songs ever written. That segue is better than those scooters I talked about earlier. So let's get into the new top 5. So this is an interesting topic because what I'm talking about here is the most influential songs ever. So not the most popular, not the best selling. When I say influential, I mean these songs influenced the music industry, pop culture. I have to explain this because when I started researching it and looking up most influential songs ever, I started getting lists of best songs ever. And those are two totally different things. I have on this top 5, obviously 5 and 5 honorable mentions. And I can say I have 2 of these on my playlists out of 10. I tried to be very diplomatic with my answers, wanting historical accuracy, not just my choices. Although when it comes down to it, it is my choices, it's my show. Anyway, you'll know what I mean when I start getting into them. But as with most of these top 5s, they're in no particular order. I have honorable mentions. When I start getting into these, you will then see what I mean by influential songs. Honorable mentions for most influential songs ever include Billie Jean by Michael Jackson. This is influential because it was the first African-American artist to get played on MTV and kind of ushered in all the other black music stars of the 80s. Another honorable mention is Be My Baby by the Ronettes. This is the first hit song to use Phil Spector's wall of sound. It was an influential musical sound in the 1960s. Just take out the name of the murderer that created it. Another honorable mention is Respect by Aretha Franklin. This was influential for the strong feminist women's movement in the late 60s, early 70s. Another honorable mention is Like a Rolling Stone by Bob Dylan. This was influential because it wasn't the typical cookie-cutter song on the radio, being several times longer than a typical song back then. And the final honorable mention is Smells Like Teen Spirit by Nirvana. This opened the door for the whole grunge movement, influenced how many countless acts that came after. It also shows that I didn't use my own favoritism here. When I was coming up with the top 5, I could not, in all good judgment, put Smells Like Teen Spirit in the top 5 over what I have there. So those are the honorable mentions, plus kind of one line or 2 lines about why they were influential. And you'll see why I had to bounce Smells Like Teen Spirit to the honorable mentions when we get into the actual top 5, because it's going to start with number 1, Anarchy in the UK by the Sex Pistols. This is from 1976. This is what bumped Nirvana to the honorable mentions. I see it as Anarchy in the UK influenced bands that influenced Nirvana, so how can I put them above? I guess if that makes sense. This one album by the Sex Pistols basically launched punk music into the mainstream. That's what I mean by influential. When a song basically influences a whole genre of music and then generations of musicians after, it should be on this list, or this type of list. The band included members like Johnny Rotten, Sid Vicious. Their one album was Nevermind the Bollocks, Here's the Sex Pistols. Ironically, Nirvana's album Nevermind was influenced by the Sex Pistols, and I guess Johnny Rotten didn't like that. It is amazing how a band that had one album of original material could be so influential. Number 2 is That's All Right Mama by Elvis Presley. This might not have been the first rock song to be a hit on the radio, but it was the one that broke it through to the mainstream. So rock and roll became the form of music because of this song, because of Elvis Presley. Elvis's version of the song wasn't the original, as it was written by Arthur Big Boy Crudup in 1946. Elvis's version came out in July 1954. It was so popular on Dewey Phillips' Red Hot and Blue radio show on that debut night that Elvis had to actually come into the studio in Memphis, Tennessee and give an interview. And from that point, it was all systems go for Elvis, for rock and roll. Just think about all of the musical acts that Elvis influenced. Hundreds, thousands. And it all started with That's All Right Mama in 1954. Number 3 is I Want to Hold Your Hand by the Beatles. Speaking of musical acts that Elvis influenced, the Fab Four, this kicked off the Beatles' British invasion, Beatlemania. The song was released in the UK at the end of December 1963, and when it crossed over to the United States, it led to the Beatles coming to America in February 1964, their historic appearances on The Ed Sullivan Show, and then becoming one of the most important musical acts in the history of the business. Think about it. The Beatles have been broken up officially for 56 years, and think about how important their music still is. They just released Anthology 4. The Beatles influenced music through music videos. They did movies that they were in. Paul McCartney used to plug his bass into the amp to make it louder on songs. So in some ways, if you hear these young people with their loud thumping bass going by, it kind of is influenced by Paul McCartney because he wanted to be heard. He wanted his bass to be heard. Number 4 is Crossroad Blues by Robert Johnson. You ever hear of the 27 Club? Well, here's the founding member. The song was officially released in 1937 with the mythical, mysterious Robert Johnson only having a few sessions to record music. His Delta blues sound, it influenced everything in the genre of the blues to come after. Back in the 1930s, you had jazz, you had orchestra, big band. Blues came along, changed things. It helped to influence rock and roll. It obviously helped to influence R&B, rhythm and blues. For those that don't know the story of Robert Johnson, I'll sum it up real quick. He was a struggling musician who seemed to not have any talent and didn't really seem to want to give up. And then he vanished for a little while, showed back up, and was this amazing guitarist. And the legend was he had sold his soul to the devil for the talent to play guitar. And when Johnson died in August 1938 at the age of 27 under mysterious circumstances, it was said that the devil came to collect his soul. For as influential as this song was and Robert Johnson was to the blues, he didn't get his due until decades after he had died. And finally, number 5 on the list of top 5 most influential songs ever is Rapper's Delight by the Sugar Hill Gang. It's in the title, Rap. This song launched hip-hop into the mainstream. The song was released in September 1979. As far as rap songs go, obviously it influenced the whole genre, but there's not a lot of depth to the lyrics. In fact, there are versions of this song that are 7 minutes long with just lots of lyrics, and it ends up being about like going to dinner at a friend's house. When I think of the deeply politically charged lyrics of Chuck D and Public Enemy that I listened to in middle school, it's way, way more impactful, those lyrics, than Sugar Hill Gang singing about meatloaf. But that's not the point. The point is that this pushed hip-hop into the mainstream culture. When you think of the OGs for rap, you might think of someone like Run DMC. That's the first one I would think of, but they were influenced by the Sugar Hill Gang. But there you go. Top 5 most influential songs ever, at least on my list. Does it make sense what I was going for here? I tried my best to explain why each of these songs was put in there. Maybe there are some that I missed. I tried to cover most of the 20th century. It was almost like I looked at who was important today as far as music goes, and you start walking it backwards. Well, who influenced them? And then who influenced them? And you go back and back and back. All right, I think I've done enough explaining of this. This segment is done. My love for the Stranger Things television show is probably fairly apparent to longtime listeners because from the very beginning of this show, almost every episode, the last segment starts with the music you're hearing now, which is pretty obviously a knockoff version of the Stranger Things theme song. I mean, God, it's even called Weirder Stuff. I can only speak for me, but the show affected me because it shined a light on my childhood growing up in the 1980s. For those that watch the show, I would be the age of the Derek and Holly characters in season 5. So younger than the main cast, but alive and kicking in those days. Generation X was like the last generation of people that you get outside and come back when the streetlights are on, like feral children running wild. So this show was like we were being seen. And keeping up with the nostalgia theme of my show, I thought, what better way to pay tribute to Stranger Things than to discuss one of the main themes, one of the main through lines of the show, and that is the Dungeons and Dragons game. A lot of people know the name, not as many know what it's all about. I'm not gonna sit here and pretend like I played it all the time or that I know everything about it. That's what research is for. The origins of Dungeons and Dragons goes all the way back to the 1950s. D&D, it evolved from something called historical miniature war gaming. It was a hobby that was popular in the 50s. It involved recreating battles using toy soldiers and complex rule systems. The big thing was that these games focused on realism, statistics, and military strategy. One of the most influential rule sets was called Chainmail. This came out in 1971. It was a medieval miniature combat game created by Gary Gygax and Jeff Perrin. While Chainmail primarily simulated historical battles, it included a fantasy supplement featuring dragons, heroes, magic, and mythical creatures, which was an unusual addition. The original Dungeons and Dragons came out in 1974. It was released by Tactical Studies Rules, a company co-founded by Gary Gygax. I mentioned him a moment ago from the Chainmail game. He was a prolific game designer and organizer of gaming conventions from Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. The original Dungeons and Dragons game came in 3 small brown booklets. 1 was Men and Magic, 2 was Monsters and Treasure, 3 was The Underworld and Wilderness Adventures. Key innovations of the original Dungeons & Dragons game was that players controlled a single character, there was a dungeon master who acted as a referee and storyteller, there was open-ended gameplay driven by imagination, and you got experience points, leveling, character classes, and alignment. The game initially sold modestly, but word of mouth spread and the popularity of Dungeons & Dragons started to grow. In the late 70s, we saw the creation of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, called AD&D. This was created by Gygax to standardize rules and reduce ambiguity. There were major releases like Monster Manual in 1977, Player's Handbook in 1978, and Dungeon Master's Guide in 1979. AD&D became the definitive version for tournaments and organized play. This is where you start to get the cultural explosion of Dungeons and Dragons. By the late 70s, you had D&D clubs appearing in schools and colleges, fantasy novels and art surging in popularity, and Tactical Studies Rules, Gygax's company, exploded in popularity, expanded rapidly, and became a major publisher. D&D inspired an entire industry of role-playing games, including RuneQuest, Traveler, and Call of Cthulhu. Then we move into the 80s, and we move into a part of the story that those of you that watch Stranger Things are probably familiar with, and that is the Satanic Panic. This began in the early 80s with wild claims that D&D, heavy metal music, were causing kids to join satanic cults. And these would involve kidnappings, animal sacrifice, sexual abuse. There was a lot of sensationalism in the media, weird therapy techniques on children like hypnosis to quote-unquote recover repressed memories about these satanic cults. You longtime listeners of the podcast know that I talked way back in episode 14 about being a metalhead when I was very young. It was around the time of the Satanic Panic I had albums to play on my Fisher-Price record player by Twisted Sister and Rat and Motley Crue. I wasn't in any satanic cult. I was 8 years old. Criticisms of D&D at the time said that the game promoted Satanism and witchcraft, encouraged suicide or mental illness, and led players to blur fantasy and reality. And there were even several high-profile tragedies falsely linked to Dungeons & Dragons despite there being no credible evidence. Despite there being no connection between D&D and Satanism, TSR, the company that created it, did combat criticism by changing the game somewhat. Demons and devils were renamed, religious symbolism was softened, and content was toned down in later editions. Obviously, this is the point in the Dungeons & Dragons story where the Stranger Things timeline comes in. The show starts in November 1983, and by the time season 5 ends, there's all of that hellfire going on where their club is seen as a satanic cult. I don't remember the Satanic Panic. I was, 6, 7, 8 years old at the time. Looking back on it with my wisdom and my years now, it seems like it was majorly overblown, but I'm sure at the time it seemed like it had some shred of credibility. Despite there being strong brand recognition, TSR suffered from the overproduction of products, poor financial management, internal conflicts. Gary Gygax was forced out of the company in 1985 and later sold his shares. Right now I'm kind of hitting pause on the history of D&D because we're at the point where Stranger Things is linked in. So what I wanted to do was kind of run you through the basic setup of a game of Dungeons & Dragons at that time in the mid-1980s. You had rule books. Most groups used a basic or an expert D&D or advanced Dungeons & Dragons. You usually had either the player's handbook, like I mentioned, Dungeon Master's Guide, Monster Manual. Often it was only the Dungeon Master book that was with the full set of the game. When you gathered to play, it was in person, usually a friend's basement, bedroom floor, kitchen table. These games of D&D could last 4 to 8 hours. They would typically be on weekends. I would assume if you were a kid, you had school during the week. There would be copious amounts of snacks, pizza, soda, Doritos, maybe Jolt. There was no online play or apps, so if you couldn't make it, your character might be guarding the horses, or they might be temporarily turned to stone, or just mysteriously vanish. You created your characters. Most players rolled 3d6 in order, be something like strength first, then intelligence. Low stats were common and accepted. You didn't optimize. You played what the dice gave you. Races and classes of characters were limited. You had classes like fighter, cleric, magic user, and thief. Races like human, elf, dwarf, halfling. You had your character sheet that was pencil and paper only with lots of erasing as you changed and evolved. The combat in D&D was slow, deadly, and rules heavy, with key features like the initiative was often rolled once per side, attack rolls used THAC0, 2-hit armor class 0. The armor class counted down, with the lower being better. Combat maps, they were optional, with many of the dungeon masters describing everything verbally. Characters could die easily, especially at low levels. There were no safety nets. The dungeon master was the absolute referee, the world builder, the storyteller. Every now and then, they would be the adversary. The adventures were often homebrew. Dungeons were graph paper maps. Traps were brutal and unfair by modern standards, with problem solving mattering way more than the character ability. Like, if you didn't say, I checked the floor for traps, you might just fall into a trap. When it came to the role-playing part of playing D&D in the 80s, there was less acting, more describing actions. Voices were optional, often goofy. The moral choices were simpler. It was good versus evil, with alignments mattering. That being said, some groups did get deep and dramatic, especially as these D&D campaigns went on for years. And you basically had house rules when it came to D&D games. There could be made-up spells or magic items or modifying critical hits, and you could argue over the rules until the dungeon master said that's how it works, and that was the end. Playing D&D in the 80s felt mysterious, creative, slightly dangerous in-game and socially, especially with the satanic panic. And it was like you were inventing something new every time you played. I found it interesting that in Stranger Things, the character of Mike is the dungeon master and he is seen as the storyteller, because back in high school, and probably still to this day, I am the storyteller of my friend group. You can tell by all of the creative projects that I do that I like creating things. And I'd like to think after 200-something episodes, I have a pretty good storyteller vibe to me when it comes to GenX nostalgia. D&D, the game, it continued chugging along in various incarnations until the modern renaissance from 2014 to now, marked by the 5th edition of D&D with streamlined rules, emphasis on narrative and accessibility. It kind of returned to their storytelling roots. And then Stranger Things came along in 2016 and really shined a light on the game. The legacy of Dungeons & Dragons and its cultural impact is that it created the role-playing game genre. It influenced fantasy literature and world building. It shaped modern video game design. It changed how people tell collaborative stories. It also fostered creativity and social interaction, and has done so across generations. It's been over 50 years. From its creation in 1974 to today, Dungeons & Dragons has endured moral panic, corporate collapse, shifting cultural tastes, but its survival and success lie in its core idea, which is shared storytelling powered by imagination. And for those that already miss Stranger Things, obviously there are a few spin-offs coming, and I won't spoil anything if you haven't heard about those, but you can always feel connected to the show by trying to learn Dungeons & Dragons. I would say find videos of people playing it online, but if these games go 4 to 8 hours, yeesh, you just fall asleep. But more than being just a game, Dungeons & Dragons is a creative framework, and it's one that continues to evolve while honoring its roots. But until next week, that's going to wrap up episode 227 of the In My Footsteps podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you for making this part of your week. I hope I gave you your dose of GenX nostalgia. They're all fun ones to put together and record, but this was a particularly fun one. And we're going to keep the content train rolling. Next week is episode 228. We're going to look back at some of the most famous or infamous daytime infomercial products. I'll just say Life Call and leave it at that. You fill in the blanks. You'll see next week. We're going to do a deep dive into the MTV Unplugged series of TV shows. Those were a huge part of my middle school, high school years. And we're also going to look at some of the biggest companies that were destroyed when the dot-com bubble burst at the beginning of the 21st century. All of those fun topics are coming up next week on episode 228 of the podcast. If you enjoy my work, and I'm hoping that if you got to this point in the show that you do, you can support me by becoming a member on Patreon for $5 a month. You can also buy me a coffee. Those go as little as $1. Of course, you can always share my work. That's the biggest thing to help a content creator, is to share what they do. And boy, I have loads of content. 220 plus podcast episodes, more than 700 YouTube videos, at least that many blogs, 10 books. I've got a film that I acted in. There's so many links in the podcast notes. If you're curious about the things that I've done, just start there. I mentioned earlier in the podcast that the finale of Stranger Things had such an impact on me mentally that it caused me to kind of change my plans for 2026. What I meant by that was that I actually ended up having to turn down a couple of projects that were laid on my plate. Now, rejecting these projects, it doesn't free up loads of time. I've still got loads that I have to do in 2026. But I'm trying to not overwhelm myself, to leave a little more time to have a life and to have friends. Because I feel like I'm constantly trying to add more and more to my plate. So it's like an excuse why I don't have time to do anything with anyone. And just seeing all the relationships in Stranger Things made me miss that. It made me miss my high school days, yes, and my 30th reunion is this year. But it also made me realize that I'm so much more in control of my life, my schedule, my happiness. I said that my big goal for 2026 was to create the best version of myself. I'm still there, still doing it. And I also feel that if you create the best version of yourself, that which you seek will find you. It is the dog days of winter. We've still got 2 more months till spring. It's going to be cold even though the days are starting to get longer. So lean into the things that make you happy, whether it's favorite foods, favorite people, favorite podcasts. And just remember, do what makes you happy. As long as it's not hurting someone else, then do it. And I'll be back next week for another escape back into our childhoods, my fellow Gen Xers. But until then, remember, in this life, don't walk in anyone else's footsteps, create your own path, and enjoy every moment you can on this journey we call life, because you never know what tomorrow brings. This has been the In My Footsteps podcast. I am Christopher Setterlin. You already knew that. And I'll talk to you all again soon.